It's so great seeing all of you here. And if Dr. King had this perspective, he would know that he is seeing in this place his dream coming true. Now, when I was asked to deliver this keynote, I said, I'm going to have to wear a suit and tie and dress shoes. And then I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. Thought, well, at least I got to wear a tie and dress shoes. No, not going to do that. Because people dress up, they go to church, they say good things, and then they walk out the door in our nation's history, and they buy and sell or slave. They dress up, put on a coat and tie, and then go out later in the week in Mississippi and they lynch somebody. So clothes don't mean anything. The words don't mean anything unless we act on them. And we've got work to do. These are my work clothes. So this is why I'm dressed like this, to remind me that there is work to do to further Dr. King's dream that someday all people will be embraced by this nation's founding words. That when they were written, were not believed by the men who composed and signed them. All men are created equal. They did not believe that. They believed that certain men who looked like them, owned property like them, were of the same social standing as they were. They were created equal. We are in a relay of light. Everyone's heard of Relay for Life, but we are in a relay of light. A relay of light into the darkness. And it's been going on for decades. Dr. King was in that relay of light. Barbara Johns, the young African-American woman who in 1951 led the strike just up there. She was in the relay of light. They have run their light to us, and it's up to us to take that light, let it fire our own hearts, and we take it as far as we can go. As Dr. King said, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. And hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And not weak love, strong love, muscular idealism. Idealism that is not going to give up in the face of pushback. Idealism that knows it's going to take tenacious dedication and work. I was so glad to hear about how many people participated in the service component of this week. That is fantastic. Longwood does a really good job of offering opportunities to change the world where we are at today. And we start changing the world by changing the world in ourselves. Because that's where the first civil war is always fought. That's why, for instance, Jesus didn't go after governments. Jesus engaged people. Because that's where the war is waged. That's where the war is won. Every civil war that is fought with weapons is first fought in the heart of someone who then goes and pulls the trigger or decides not to. What we all can do and what you can do is live your lives as if it was your destiny to be exactly where you are, to look around you and to do it now and say, I am meant to be here. What needs doing in this community or this room or this house? What needs doing that I can do, that I can do. And I promise you that every one of you, when you leave this place, at least once in your lives, you will have an opportunity to do something quite special that no one else can do, that only you can do it. You will have that opportunity. It will not last there forever. So you have to be able to recognize it and believe that it is your destiny to be where you are. And it may well be your destiny. And even if it's not, if you make it your destiny, it is. I'm serious. I promise you, when you go out into that world, you become mothers and fathers, you have business connections, career connections, but they'll only be a part of it. You'll have opportunities to give yourself to the community. And I would be very much surprised if anyone in this room had not already done so in this community or in your home communities. I want to make sure we fully appreciate where we are, that this community is the birthplace of the civil rights movement, not in Prince Edward County, not the birth of the civil rights movement in Virginia, but the birthplace of the civil rights movement in the United States of America. And Barbara Rose Johns, a 16-year-old who was going to school in Robert Russa Moton High School, which is now the Moton Museum, could no longer tolerate the separate and grossly unequal conditions at her school when several blocks right over there, it's been taken down, there was a 2-story brick white high school that was a relative Taj Mahal in comparison. It had an inner courtyard. Meanwhile, for African Americans, when they asked the white powers that be for new school facilities, a new school, instead, they got tar paper shacks. There were classes, a school bus. There were classes held simultaneously in the auditorium. A school that was built for about 180 or so students had well over 400. She decided to do something about it. And she enlisted a small group of key leaders at that school. These are teenagers. Now imagine a 16-year-old young woman today taking on the government. That would be audacious. But to do it in 1951 and to be an African American is courage beyond my ability to comprehend. But she and that group, one of whom was John Stokes, they planned a strike. John Stokes said they dubbed it the Manhattan Project, which was the code name for the project developing the atomic bomb in World War II. They came up with that to remind themselves that they could tell no one, not their brother, not their sister, not a friend. And on April 23rd, 1951, this is more than 4 years before Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. They called the student body into the auditorium. They had lured the principal out down to the train station. They told the teachers just to go away. And Barbara Johns, John Stokes, and the others announced to the student body that they were going on strike. They were going to walk out so that they could get a new school. They went on strike for 2 weeks. I used to think I had to argue that was the birth of the civil rights movement in this country. No longer have to, because the U.S. Civil Rights Trail was opened last year, and on their website they have a timeline of significant events in the civil rights movement, and the very first one is that strike up there, and by years. So we are in a historic place, an historic community. The story that happened here is not one that's confined in its importance to the county or the state, but indeed, absolutely, to the nation. As you know, the students followed up their 2-week strike with legal action. They contacted the NAACP lawyers who told them, we're no longer taking legal cases to fight for separate but equal. We are now going after segregation itself. It didn't take the students or their families any time at all to say that's what we will do. And as you know, the Davis versus County School Board of Prince Edward County case became incorporated with Brown versus Board of Education, those 5 cases, and that in 1954 the Supreme Court decided that separate was inherently unequal and that segregated public schools must go. Now, when the students came back from that 2-week strike on May 6th, they came back to Moton, and there was a 15-foot high cross burning in the schoolyard. When the papers were filed, you couldn't buy ammunition in Prince Edward County. You could find no shotgun shells. The African American community went into what they call cover me mode. You had to go to Richmond to buy ammunition, or Lynchburg, because it was sold out. The attorney, Oliver Hill, keenly smart, but also wisely compassionate, he would only allow individuals who owned property to sign on to the Davis case that became part of Brown. And it was for their own protection, because he knew, and he knew that the whites knew, someone who owns their property, they have the right of self-defense if somebody comes after them. Someone who rents does not have that legal protection. So John Stokes told me that African American families, after dark, there's a knock on the door. They didn't answer the door until one of the male members of the family got a gun, a shotgun, went out the back door, went around the side to the front yard to make sure it was safe to open the door. No one died in Prince Edward County. The violence here was psychological. Barbara Johns' family came back from an out-of-town trip just after the Brown decision in May of 1954. They lived out in Darlington Heights. It's about 7 or 8 miles past Hampden, Sydney. And when they came home, their home was not there. Ashes were there, smoke, flickering flames. They were thanked for leading this nation to integrated schools, to schools where black children and white children could read. All men are created equal in the same classroom. They were thanked by having their home burned to the ground. Likewise, the Brown decision prompted the white community here to make plans to end public education if necessary. In 1956, a manifesto was signed and passed in Congress, and former Governor Byrd, Harry Byrd, urged the Virginia General Assembly to adopt legislation that would allow the governor to close schools at which integration was imminent. And the General Assembly did just that. They gave Governor Allman the power to do that. 9 schools in the fall of 1958, 9 white schools, 1 in Warren County, 2 in Charlottesville, and 6 in Norfolk, were closed because integration was imminent. African Americans were seeking to integrate those schools. So September 1958, a handful of schools, those white schools, were closed by the governor, who had that authority given to him by the General Assembly. But in February of 1959, the governor reversed course. There were 2 legal decisions, one by the Virginia Supreme Court that said it's unconstitutional to do that. Rather than fight and take it to the U.S. Supreme Court, Governor Allman surprised everybody, went on TV, said, we're not doing this anymore. Reopened the schools, massive resistance, that's what they called it, massive resistance to Brown, is gone. That's February of 1959. But yet in June of 1959, Prince Edward County, not forced by the governor, they did it to themselves, the white powers that be wiped public education off the face of their corner of the earth. They defunded public education. Every school was locked. No trespassing signs were put up in the schoolyards. Over 4,000 white residents of this county had signed a petition asking the Board of Supervisors to do just that. The leading advocate of erasing public education in this community was the editorials of the Farmville Herald, written by J. Barry Wall, Sr. Now, the whites had begun immediately to put together fallout shelters for the white children after the county made that nuclear decision to end public education. A private foundation was created and a private whites-only school popped up like that. The state allowed state tuition grants to be used by the white families to pay for that education. Prince Edward County provided taxpayer funds to the white families for the white children to go to the whites-only school. Tax dollars that African American families would have contributed to, as with the state tuition grants. No such thing was provided for the African Americans. And over 2,000 African American children were left without a formal education in their lives because of the 5 years of massive resistance. Schools were closed effective June of 1959 is when the county made that decision, and they did not reopen until September of 1964, when the United States Supreme Court, in a decision that I would say is equal to Brown, it's one that this nation is woefully ignorant of, but it's the Griffin versus County School Board of Prince Edward County case. That is significant because despite Brown, Prince Edward County could end public education. That decision was ineffectual in stopping Prince Edward County from doing that. The Griffin decision affected me, my children, your children, because the Griffin decision, the United States Supreme Court affirmed the right of every American child to a public education. That is a huge decision. Again, the war that was fought, it's a civil war after the Civil War over the progression of full equality and equal protection under the law for African Americans, a war that we are still fighting. That was not confined to this community or even this state. Across the nation, particularly in the South, everyone was following the legal battle over the school closures here. Everyone knew that the outcome of this case would affect the entire nation, and that if the African American case here failed, then a county in Alabama or Mississippi or Maryland or Massachusetts, anywhere, if the African American community pushed too far in the eyes of the whites for voting rights, for housing rights, for anything, they could say, no, you stop now or we will do what they did in Prince Edward County. Martin Luther King came through Farmville in 1962, and his message was stand firm, keep fighting. He knew that the fate of the nation, public education in the nation, was at stake. Likewise, white segregationists and white supremacists across the country were telling the white powers that be, do not give in, do not give in. Even after schools reopened in September of 1964, Prince Edward County continued to fund, through taxpayer dollars, tuition grants to the white families to go to Prince Edward County, as it was called. It's just hard to believe that any of that is real, that any of that happened. When I was your age, I had no idea that any of that had taken place. I was born here in Farmville in 1957, May of 1957, because my father was going to Hampton-Sydney College. He and my mother were from Richmond. They got married real young. They eloped. And I was born when my mom was 18. My dad had just finished his sophomore year at Hampton-Sydney. So they rented a place on High Street. And then a couple of weeks before the county was going to close schools, voted to close schools, they moved back to Richmond after my dad graduated. And I never should have come back here. But I applied to 4 colleges, UVA, Virginia Tech, James Madison, and because a number of my family members had attended Hampton-Sydney, I applied there, but Hampton-Sydney wasn't in my top 3. I'd have gone to UVA in a heartbeat, or Tech or JMU. I wasn't really keen on going to an all-male school, but Hampton-Sydney is the only one that offered me admissions. So I was born here, and then I had to come back. And then after graduation, an English major, I graduated, typical naive dreams, I was going to write the great American novel. I was going to get a job at a big daily newspaper. And, well, the only job offer I had was at the Farmville Herald. So, born here, had to come back, and then I couldn't leave. So you think about destiny. In retrospect, I can see some things fitting together. Hampton-Sydney ended up being where I needed to be. If I hadn't gone to Hampton-Sydney, I wouldn't be standing here. But I went to work there totally ignorant of this community's history. Went to Hampton-Sydney for 4 years, never heard of it, never heard of it. In the first year at the Herald, I hear these footsteps coming up the stairwell. The Hampton-Sydney professor's wife stops in front of my desk. She doesn't say a word, but her eyes are throwing the proverbial daggers at me. I have no idea what I've done to offend her. Finally, she just says, "You know what happened here, don't you?" I went, "I have no idea what you're talking about, none." Kept throwing the daggers with her eyes, and finally she said, "You need to go to Longwood, go to the rare book room, and ask for this book, They Closed Their Schools by Bob Smith." She threw a couple more looks at me and left, and I had to find out what the hell she was talking about. I waited till she had exited the building, and then I followed. The Herald office is just a couple blocks there, so it was just 2.5 blocks to Longwood's library, which is the building where the president's office is now. And it was a book you couldn't check out. I could see it as if it were yesterday. I went into the rare book room, asked for the book, sat in a chair to the left of the door. The title of the book said something, and I started to feel really uneasy. Then I started flipping through the pages, and I started recognizing words. I started recognizing names. I kept seeing the Farmville Herald. I kept seeing J. Barry Wall Sr. And those words and names started flying up from those pages at me like shrapnel. And it was as if all the bones in my body had been pulled out. I couldn't check the book out. They don't let you do that. But I'd seen enough to feel as if life had parachuted me behind enemy lines. Because the Farmville Herald was owned by the same family. The same guy who wrote the racist, white supremacist editorials calling for massive resistance was there. I was in a community that had done that to its own children. I couldn't imagine it then. I still can't imagine it, though I spent all 36 years of my professional life here. I still can't believe it happened. The 2.5 blocks back from the library to the newspaper office were far different than when I walked toward the library. The whole world had changed for me. It felt utterly different. I was in a world where something like that could take place. But for a 22-year-old, it was as if, okay, that was horrific, but it's in the past. It's over and done. Because when you're 22, something that happened when you were 5 or 6 years old, I mean, it just, from that perspective, it just seems so long ago. But it didn't take me long to begin to understand that that was just not the truth. That I was in a continuum. And because I was at the Herald, I was a part of the story, whether I wanted to be or not. And I fully understood why the Hampton-Sydney professor's wife felt the way she did. She had to have assumed logically that I knew what had happened in Prince Edward County. I knew what the newspaper had done. I knew that the same family owned it, and I willingly sought employment there. So she perceived me as endorsing it and saying, I want to be on that team. But what she didn't know was if I had had any idea, I wouldn't have walked over the threshold of that building for any reason whatsoever. I grew up in Richmond, and in elementary school, it was 100% white school, Mary Munford in Richmond's West End. And then West Hampton Junior High, there were probably about 12 to 15 African Americans. And then in 1970, the courts ordered busing to enforce desegregation. And so the template flipped. I went from virtually all white schools for the next 3 years. The population at Albert Hill Middle School and Thomas Jefferson High School was probably 85% African American. And during those 3 years, my experience just absolutely reinforced, and I thank God that I had always felt this way, that people are people and skin pigment means nothing. But it was my African American friends at both Hill and Thomas Jefferson that stood up for me against white bullies. And I remember my English teacher, and we studied To Kill a Mockingbird in that class. And under those circumstances, it was extraordinarily powerful. But all of the guys had a crush on Ms. Lewis. And the last day of school, I got my camera, went back and took her picture because I had a crush on her too. And Ms. Lewis was African American. I still have that photograph in a trunk somewhere. I never should have become editor of the Farmville Herald, but I did in 1991 after the editor, one of the Wall sons, who was just a couple years older than me, just left out of the blue. Nobody knew why. So they turned to me and allowed me to write some editorials, and 12 months later they named me editor. And so for the 25 years, all the editorials were written by me. I never asked permission. I didn't tell them what I was going to write about. I pushed the envelope as far as I could. One time I pushed it so far I just about fell out the other end of the envelope. But one day, February 18th, 2003, I was driving from my wife and I's home in Appomattox to work. I was approaching the Prince Edward Appomattox County line, and I was thinking about two things. The General Assembly was debating whether or not to have an apology or resolution expressing its profound regret for the closing of schools in Prince Edward County and the state's role in those closures. And a Prince Edward County high school Latin teacher, Longwood Davis, had just approached the school board with the suggestion that honorary diplomas be awarded to those who had been locked out of school and not allowed to earn a real one. Those two ideas flowed instantly into my head in a flash. There was goodness in both, but if the state is going to say, I'm sorry, they need to say, I'm sorry, and this is what I intend to do about it. While there's healing, it was a beautiful gesture to suggest honorary diplomas, and those would be awarded. But that doesn't give back what was stolen, and what was stolen from those individuals was educational opportunity. And it was reparation. That word was in my head immediately. And it's a beautiful word. For some people who don't understand it, they consider it a four-letter word. Well, if it's a four-letter word, I consider it to be love. Because if you can repair the harm, that's all reparation means, is to repair the harm, to fix what is broken, and we have a moral responsibility to do so. Not because any of us are to blame for the deeds of the past. We're not responsible for those, but we are responsible for the time in which we find ourselves. Because this nation is still being founded. We are still striving to live up to our founding documents and ideals. And we all have the opportunity, the responsibility to be a founding father or a founding mother. Barbara Johns certainly was. Dr. King certainly was. And we certainly can be. We certainly must be. Well, the idea I had was state-funded scholarships for those individuals who were locked out of school for 5 years, from 59 to 64. And it would be a program that would go to them wherever they were educationally, whether they needed to learn how to read, and they could go earn their GED, they could go to community college, a 4-year college, get a master's, get a doctorate. It would be continuous. You could do the whole journey, start wherever you could or wanted to, and take it as far as you could. And I was so excited. I was so excited by this idea that I felt a little drunk. It's 8 o'clock in the morning, and I am just buzzed because this idea has come to me. And I've hardly been at work at all when I had commitment from a state senator and a member of the House of Delegates to introduce the idea as legislation the next year, because it was too late to do it in 2003. Well, then I called a friend of mine, John Stokes, a friend of Barbara Johns, who had told me about the ammunition being sold out. He was a retired educator living just outside D.C. And I said, John, listen to this. And his response sobered me up just like that. I knew that excitement, happiness, absolutely the wrong emotions. His immediate response was, this is what we've been praying for. This is what we've been praying for. Now think. He helped plan the strike. They helped give this country the Brown decision. And then instead of having a parade down Main Street celebrating what its own county residents had done, Prince Edward County shuts down public schools. I cannot imagine the pain he and others who planned that strike would have felt looking back at Prince Edward County after they graduated and seeing what had been done in reaction to the victory they had won for us all. He said, you need to go to the prophet Jeremiah. Well, I had my grandmother's Bible on the shelf behind me. And he said, you need to go to the 8th chapter. And I read these words with him. Harvest is past, summer is over, and we are not saved. I am wounded at the sight of my people's wound. I go like a mourner overcome by horror. Is there no balm in Gilead, no physician there? Why has no new skin grown over their wound? I read that, and I knew that I had to give my life for this idea. When by the grace of God, an idea comes to you that you find that people who have suffered so much pain have been praying for, you have to give yourself to it. And I violated every principle in journalism. If I was doing my job, I would have just written an editorial saying, hey, the state should do this. It would be a month before I wrote a word. I did things for 4 weeks to make sure that when I wrote that editorial, it wasn't just an idea. I would be able to say, this is the idea, it's going to be legislation, we're going to be able to fight to create it. I had met Mark Warner back in 1999, and then during his campaign, we'd had some conversations. So I was able to call him up, call his press secretary up at the end of March in 2003. Her name was Ellen Qualls, and say, Ellen, I've got an idea I'd like to talk to the governor about. Will you ask him to call me? And he called me a couple days later at the Herald, and I told him about it. And his heart was all for it. His head was kind of spinning in the mud because Virginia had a huge, huge economic problem, not of his making. I knew he would be our biggest ally if he would fight with us. We had a meeting in Richmond, and John Stokes was one of those who was there. And I sat to Mark Warner's left. He presented the idea. He spent the whole time giving us reasons why Virginia couldn't do it. They couldn't afford it. He said, we're bankrupt, Chapter 9. He was horrified at the prospect of the General Assembly voting it down in 2004, the 50th anniversary of the Brown decision. He feared the state being embarrassed nationally. And then he said, you know, if we do this, then other people are going to come up and say, well, we were hurt this way or that way. And I tried not to be rude, but I said, no, Governor, you're wrong. There's nothing like this. It's unparalleled. No community in the United States of America had its public education taken away. Prince Edward County had all the racism and slavery and Jim Crow, everything that every other community had where they manifested themselves. But no other community had 5 years of massive resistance. So finally he turned to me and said, I'll fight with you on this. What happened over the next 16 months until the bottom of the ninth inning vote by the General Assembly in June of 2004 was devious, backstabbing, improbable. The legislation was crushed, and then miraculously it would pass with nearly unanimous bipartisan support. Remember, Mark Warner, Democratic governor, the General Assembly, both houses controlled by Republicans, in a former capital of the Confederacy. But yet the first reparation in U.S. history was created with virtually unanimous support. That didn't come easy. I'll just give you a couple of examples. The House of Delegates, at the first crack at it, took out the word appropriation. We'll create the scholarships, but there's not going to be any money. Well, a scholarship is the money. A scholarship is a grant and aid. So the Senate says, well, we'll create it, but there has to be money. How do those fit? Then I found out, because I start working with 5 or 6 former governors of the Commonwealth, because I could tell Mark Warner needed a push in the backside. So I contacted other governors to get them to take a public stand with him. And I'll never forget when Gerald Bilals said, you give Mark Warner an ultimatum from Governor Holton and Governor Robb. And I'm thinking, this is surreal. I'm the editor of the Farmville Herald, and this governor is telling me to give the seated governor an ultimatum from 3 governors. It just was totally improbable. But the most amazing thing in a negative way was, and Rita Mosley, she is dressed in red over there. We went to Richmond because our state senator was not fighting, I thought, at all for the money we needed. So I contacted Senator Henry Marsh and asked him if he would take the fight to the Senate floor. So he came up with an idea to get the full $2 million for our budget amendment. So we're sitting there watching the Senate debate when the senator who sponsored the legislation, it's his bill. He gets up and argues against funding his own bill. I mean, that's mind-boggling. Instead of saying, yes, thank you, that's going to fully fund it, he argued against fully funding his own bill. But yet, it was created so we can move forward as a nation. We can move forward as a nation if we call each other up before we call each other out. If we give someone on the other side of the aisle or the other side of the debate the chance to be a part of a solution in a genuine way, when we stop using ideas as political weapons to enhance our own profile or election prospects, when we want to work together, I've seen it happen. I've been a part of it, and I know there are enough good people, despite the headlines and despite some people who are in political office, that there is hope. It's going to be a hard row to hoe, but there is hope because of what happened here. Now I want to share a brief passage in this book, and then I'll close with where we can go from here. But there's an historical marker on Main Street in front of First Baptist Church that just says, Martin Luther King came to Farmville. He came to this church. Well, we're celebrating Dr. King's life. And in writing the book, I was able to find several sources it's still just a snapshot of what that visit was like. But this is the only place I've seen anything that comes to telling what happened that day with Dr. King. So with you all being in this community and walking down Main Street, when you go past that church now, you'll have an idea of Dr. King's presence on that day here in Farmville. Prince Edward County's public schools were tightly shut when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. visited Farmville on March 28, 1962, accompanied by his friend and right-hand man, the Reverend Ralph D. Abernathy, and by Wyatt T. Walker, Executive Director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. King spoke at Reverend Griffin's First Baptist Church on Main Street. In his essay, 53 Hours with Martin Luther King Jr., Walker remembers Griffin telling him, "There's a church full of folks waiting to see our Moses." I couldn't believe it, Walker writes. This was a farm community. How could Griffin have a church full on Wednesday? These people have to be in the fields. It was mid-morning, but they were there. They wanted to see and hear this internationally known leader who was hopscotching around the South, off the beaten paths, bringing hope and lifting the morale of the plain and simple people of the land. You could see it in their eyes and written all over their faces. Martin Luther King Jr. is really here in Prince Edward County, Virginia. The pain, too, was clearly visible. The SCLC director noted the obvious lines of weariness and strain on the face of Reverend Griffin, whom he had known for years. And as Dr. King subsequently spoke to children in the church's fellowship hall, Walker wrote, I could not help asking myself, what kind of nation are we? 3 whole years and no public schools. 3 years would become 5. King's visit was covered in the March 30th edition of the Farmville Herald, which reported that he told those gathered in the church that he was concerned about your agonizing and suffering moments here in Prince Edward County. You have not accepted a half loaf. We all realize that if we are to be free, we cannot sell our birthright of freedom for a mess of segregated pottage. The suffering, King knew, would continue, and he did not hide that fact according to the newspaper's coverage. But the ultimate goal, he believed, would be worth the pain. Stand firm, and things will get better. Do not despair. Do not give up. But just stand firm for what you believe in. And people all over the United States will say there are black people of Prince Edward County who have injected new meaning in the veins of civilization, he said. Speaking directly to the hammer and nails of massive resistance, King said, "Before you wear the crown of freedom, there is a cross that we must bear." But that Calvary, he assured them, would not be the end of the story. Good Friday spells temporary defeat, he said, but Easter is coming. Just keep on keeping on, and there will be a new day of freedom. When I come back, I will see you sitting in integrated schools. Praising the courageous leadership provided by Griffin, King said the church's pastor has stood as a giant in this community and has not compromised on any points in his efforts to make the ideals of democracy a reality. Among those present that day was Griffin's eldest son, L. Francis Skip Griffin, Jr. The place was packed. King was king, he told me, also praising the introduction of King by Ralph Abernathy. Skip Griffin was 14 at the time. He was one of those being denied an education by his own community. More than 5 decades later, describing that moment, what he recalled most was the presence of the Spirit in his father's church. Griffin knew who King was and why the visit was important. I had heard about him from my father. It had been a long stretch. To have him come, the people needed that, especially those who were locked out of school. The timing was perfect for the people. The message Dr. King delivered resonated through his presence. Persevere in a cause that had consequences beyond the borders of their community. There are 2 words from King's message that Griffin has never forgotten. Remain firm. I remember, remain firm. Griffin also remembered a woman coming into the sanctuary that Wednesday morning with a large brown paper bag covering up something that she held in her hands. All eyes were fixed upon her as she walked up the center aisle to the front of the church. Nobody knew what would happen next, and Griffin recalled a momentary uneasiness in the church as the woman drew nearer and nearer to King. A few members of the congregation followed closely behind her just in case, wanting to ensure his safety. She stopped in front of the pulpit and pulled the paper bag away. The only thing in her hand was the Christian symbol of resurrection after crucifixion. Her only aim was a blessing. She raised the cross, offered those words to King, and returned to her seat. The preacher's son remembered another detail. Abernathy's introduction of King that morning had been based on Deuteronomy 17:15. The verse reads, "Your leader shall be the chosen one of God." The whole civil rights movement was based on an updated application of the scriptures, Griffin said. The imagery of King's words that day clearly reflected that spiritual foundation. What remains most vivid to him today is the mood and spirit of that early spring morning in 1962. The tonal pitch of it was perfect, absolutely right, Griffin said, and how uplifting it felt. Unlike the anointed kings in Deuteronomy, however, King was leading an army of plowshares against the swords arrayed against them. So where do we go from here as a nation? You will have your own ideas, and I pray the opportunity and the courage to become a part of making those solutions real. I think Prince Edward County and Virginia offer a path forward. There's a light of reconciliation on top of Prince Edward County's courthouse, and a light of reconciliation memorial on the courthouse lawn. It shines 24 hours a day over the same building where supervisors in 1959 defunded public education. The words on that memorial are a permanent public apology for massive resistance and the evil that it brought into the lives of children. The General Assembly wasn't satisfied with saying, "We're sorry." They created the Brown Scholarships. They did something about it. This nation must finally apologize for slavery, formally, permanently, and publicly, and for Jim Crow. It's unconscionable that it has never happened. About 10 years ago, the House of Representatives, and then a different year, the United States Senate, adopted resolutions that were similar, but they were never brought together into an act of Congress. They were never signed by the President of the United States. If you didn't read the story, when it happened, you wouldn't know that it ever had. I believe there should be a national light of reconciliation on the National Mall in D.C. I envision it surrounded by statues of men, women, and children of all ages and all ethnicities, joined hand in hand, walking out 360 degrees toward every point on the compass in this nation. There would be a light that shines perpetually, but also there would be those words of apology for slavery and Jim Crow permanently there. That would create a place where we as Americans could come forward. We could have our own moments of reconciliation. Then we, as humans, could go out 360 degrees. Because reconciliation starts here. True reconciliation is more than an act of Congress, just as integrating this country took more than an act by the judiciary. I also believe that apology should be read on national television, in prime time, every channel. This is something I've been advocating for years and years. When the idea first came to me, it was to have the President of the United States do it, whoever that is, when this takes place. I'm thinking now that maybe have three people. Also have the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and the Speaker of the House, because all three branches of government were involved in denying equal protection under the law. They were all involved in the racist policies of the past, just as they've been involved with healing steps that have been taken. I'm old enough to remember when Neil Armstrong first set foot on the moon, and it was 1969 was an awful year, filled with violence across the world. But in that moment, across the world, literally, where anyone had access to a television, it's the only time it's happened in our Earth's history. Everyone was sharing the same moment. They were watching it on television or listening to radio coverage, all of us. We need that same thing as a country. Neil Armstrong said this is one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Well, we need that as Americans toward one another. And then we need to do more than say we're sorry. We need to say this is what we intend to do about it. And in addition to any individual narrowly focused reparations that might be offered, I think this country needs the equivalent of a domestic Marshall Plan. After World War II, we rebuilt Europe. We need to do the same thing here. And I would see it as enduring, transformational investments in everything: education, infrastructure, job training, housing in urban and rural communities that have significant African American populations. Now, they would be colorblind in effect because entire communities would be lifted. But that would have two positive points. One, there would be greater political traction because virtually every member of Congress would be able to go to his or her constituents and say, this is what's in it for our community. And they would also unite people rather than give white supremacists a wedge saying, well, you know, that person got a check, so that's it. And how come we're not getting a check, but they got that check, so it's all good? No, it's not all good. And people will say, well, I never owned a slave. Why do I have to have anything to do with an apology? No, none of us did. But as I said before, we are not responsible for slavery, but we are responsible for this moment in time. We know how abominably hard it is and continues to be to undo the evil that people who came before us did. We are still trying to undo that. We need to do goodness that future generations would find it abominably difficult to erase. Because we cannot erase the past. The future is going to be written by someone else. This moment is ours, and it's the only one that we have. And I'll just close with this thought. Martin Luther King said he'd seen the promised land. He'd been to the mountaintop. My years of experience in this community and being involved in a journey of healing and reconciliation taught me a number of things, but one thing in particular, and that is that the promised land is not a destination. We carry the promised land with us every day in our heart, in our head, in our hands. We carry it on our backs. The promised land will go as far as we are willing to take it. Or if we refuse, it'll stay by the side of the road where some people throw it away. I said we were in a relay of light. Each one of us has special gifts, special qualities that make you unique as an individual. And you can say, no, I don't want to be in this relay of light. I'm just going to sit it out. Well, there's no sitting it out. Because if you sit it out, you're just helping the darkness. Because you will deny your community and this nation the special light that you have inside you. So let's commit and recommit every day to carry the promised land a little bit further. And what you all did this week with your service projects and what you were doing in your own lives that only you know about, and your hopes and dreams to be the best possible person you can be to bring goodness in the world. You can do it. You can do it. And I thank you for being here. Thank you so much.